Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, Atheists in Recovery land, and welcome to episode 44 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And this episode continues with our 4-part series of recovery under quarantine. And I have to admit, for today's episode, I geeked out just a little bit. So our guest today specializes in working with mindfulness as it relates to addiction, cravings, and relapse prevention, among other things. And I'll get to that in a minute. But I think that you're going to enjoy this episode. I feel like mindfulness, if you don't have a practice after listening to this episode, you might change that. You might begin to think that this is something that can really help in my addiction recovery. That's the hope anyway. And so, under our guest, Dr. David Eddy. Dr. David Eddy is a research scientist at Massachusetts General Hospital's Recovery Research Institute and Center for Addiction Medicine, a clinical psychologist at Massachusetts General Hospital's Department of Psychiatry, and an instructor at Harvard Medical School. His current research, supported by NIAAA and NIDA, is seeking to better understand affective and psychophysiological factors that both heighten addiction relapse risk as well as support addiction recovery. Additionally, Dr. Eddy conducts research aimed at developing mobile health interventions driven by smartphone applications and wearable biosensors. Okay, guys, let's get started. Dr. David Eddy, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
So tell me a little bit more about your spiritual background from childhood, something that I ask all my guests.
Sure. I grew up in a agnostic home, I think it would be safe to say. Well, maybe my dad was an atheist. My mum was an agnostic. Though I was schooled in a Christian tradition, I really didn't identify with any particular religion, faith, or spiritual path as a child. Though I did have a sense of spiritual connectedness to something in the universe. I wouldn't have been able to identify that, and I really didn't have a formal religious practice. Fast forward to my mid-20s, I'm living in San Francisco, and I start to develop an interest in meditation. Mm-hmm. And I, at that time, wanted to explore different meditation paths. And so I did a little tour of San Francisco and different meditation centers, and I explored a lot of different avenues. And eventually I came to the San Francisco Zen Center. And it was really one of those, like a clarity, really. When I remember walking in there, and it was a fairly sparse, very beautiful space, but very sparse. And I just felt very at peace in that Zen Center. And something inside of me said, this is the path, this is the place to start. And so I started attending walk-in Zazen sessions that they would hold there each evening for the public. You could come in and meditate with the resident monks and the abbot.
Wow.
And that's really where my meditation practice started in the Zen tradition. And that really grew into a Zen practice. And I consider myself a Zen Buddhist now.
Wow. That's so interesting. And so I'm sure that is informed much of the work that you do right now. I was wondering if you could tell the listeners a little bit about what you do and your research focus.
Yeah, sure. And it has. I'm a clinical psychologist at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. I'm a part-time clinician working at our adult outpatient addiction program called the West End Clinic. And part of the time I'm also working as a researcher at the Recovery Research Institute at Mass General Hospital, and also the Center for Addiction Medicine, where I study both the antecedents of addiction, how people come to be addicted, but also I'm interested in developing novel treatments for substance use disorders. And I'm particularly interested in brain-body communication and psychophysiology, and how psychological phenomena manifest in the body, and how phenomena arising in the body can affect the brain, and how this relates to substance use disorder, both in terms of how people come to develop the disorder, and also how people can recover. So I do a lot of technology-based research now using apps and ambulatory psychophysiological monitors, ambulatory heart rate monitors, for instance, so I can monitor people in real time. I use a lot of apps, and I'm currently putting together some projects working with primary care medicine at Mass General Hospital. One of the things I'm really interested in doing is expanding the scope of addictions treatment, or the breadth, so that more people have access to care. I feel like so many folks miss out on solid addiction treatment because we insist everybody needs to go to specialized addiction care. And that's not an option for everybody. Either they can't afford it, or they can't take the time off work, or they've got kids at home and they just can't go away for 4 weeks to an addiction treatment program. And not to minimize the utility of those programs. They're important. We need those. And at the same time, a lot of people come to treatment through their primary care doctor. And I think we need to be doing better in terms of meeting patients where they're at and providing care where the patient's at, rather insisting on them coming to us. And so that's a little bit about what I've been working on now.
Yeah, I love that. Just having different pathways to recovery and making it so that, everybody has these options available to them, and reducing those barriers for access to treatment. Yeah. So I wanted you on because, your work is so interesting. And I think, and I know at a time like this where there's so much uncertainty in the world, mindfulness is what I've been leaning on personally and professionally. And I thought you would be a great person to talk a little bit more about, maybe what mindfulness is, and mindfulness-based interventions, and how they can be used to help with relapse prevention and maybe even cravings. So a couple questions in there.
Yeah, sure. So broadly speaking, I'm a psychotherapist working primarily in cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy modalities. And both of these approaches, they're very, very similar in a lot of ways. But maybe I'll focus on how DBT understands mindfulness, because I think that's probably most instructive for our conversation today. Dialectical behavior therapy was a treatment that was developed for people who experience profound problems regulating their emotions, particularly folks with very serious condition called borderline personality disorder. Though we've expanded DBT to many, many other conditions and presentations, and we actually have pretty good evidence that it's helpful for addiction as well. And DBT pulls in a lot of the change-based strategies of cognitive behavioral therapy. So we're working on changing thoughts and feelings and patterns of behavior. So these are changes initiated by the individual with the help of a provider. Now, the counterpoint to that is mindfulness or acceptance-based strategies. So the reality is life will often present us with problems that require a change-based solution. But sometimes life presents us with problems which we have very little control over, that we can't change. At least we can't change them in the moment. And so trying to use a change-based strategy or tool for a problem that we have no ability to change is futile. And really suffering arises out of that because we just end up spinning our wheels. And so often in life, we're presented with these problems that we really can't control, like the coronavirus. And yet at the same time, we try and apply change-based strategies or solutions, which are inevitably going to fail. And that gives rise to frustration, further anxiety, and as you can imagine, we can get into a vicious cycle of suffering. Rather, what dialectical behavior therapy says is, well, if you can't change the situation, maybe you need to bring an acceptance-based position to that, or strategy. And I always think of the Serenity prayer, which is a famous prayer, really made famous by 12-step programs. They often say it at the beginning or end of meetings. And essentially the Serenity prayer says, grant me the serenity, to accept the things I cannot change the things I can, and have the wisdom to know the difference. And that's really what we're going for in dialectical behavior therapy. We want to learn to identify, is this a change-based situation, or a situation calling for a change-based strategy, or is really acceptance the crucial thing here? And it's really important, and I often go to great lengths to explain to my patients that radically accepting things as they are doesn't mean we have to like them.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we have to like them at all. Bad things happen. But the reality is they're here, and refusing to accept that they're here is going to give rise to suffering. It's this idea that pain, or a certain amount of pain, is inevitable in life, but suffering arises out of refusing to accept that pain is inevitable. And that's where a lot of people get stuck. And so accepting reality, accepting things as they are, even though we might not necessarily like it, is really, really important. And mindfulness really is the tool that helps us, I think, identify or understand whether something is whether a situation really calls for change or acceptance.
Yeah, I love that. Radically accepting things doesn't mean we have to agree with them,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We're not endorsing them.
Yeah.
We're not endorsing bad actors, bad behaviors, or crises that are arising in the world that are outside of people's control. Not at all. At the same time, they're here. And, we can make ourselves really pretty miserable, refusing to accept that reality. Best we accept it so we can, move on to work on the stuff we can control.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So as we look at mindfulness and this radical acceptance of things that we have no control over, how does that help with addiction?
Great question.
Yeah.
Right. So if we've got change-based strategies and acceptance-based strategies, where does mindfulness sit in that? And how can it help us match? These are the big questions. So I like to use mindfulness in my clinical practice really as a first step, as a tool to help people step back from situations, step back from whatever's arising in the moment, thoughts, feelings, behaviors they're engaging in, to just simply observe, to be able to observe and describe what's arising in that moment so that we are less reactive to what's arising. Often we get into trouble, especially in addiction. We react to thoughts or feelings or stresses that are arising in our environment. We feel anxiety. And often the action urge is for somebody with a drinking problem who's in early recovery to drink.
Yeah.
Because that's how they got relief. And you could insert any drug or really any other problematic behavior. Ultimately, we use substances and engage in other addictive behaviors to manage negative affect, sometimes to try and boost positive affect. So it serves a function in our lives. So it's not surprising that folks with addiction have very hardwired associations between affective states like anxiety and reflexes to pick up substances, because that's just primal brain, the limbic system, the lizard brain has figured out, that's what works. And so it's very reflexive. These kind of lapses are often very reflexive behaviors. And almost always there's some kind of trigger in the environment or in the individual, an emotional trigger or a thought, or memory, remorse, regrets that give rise to substance use.
Right.
And so mindfulness really allows us to step back from that and say, whoa, hell, I'm noticing anxiety. I'm noticing stress. I'm noticing tension in my body. I'm also noticing a really strong desire to go and get a drink. And what's that about? And if we can step back from that, so rather than being in it and sucked into the vortex, where it's like feeling behavior, the one where the feeling arises and bam, we're straight into the behavior we don't want to be doing. Mindfulness allows us to step back and say, okay, I'm noticing feelings arising. I could drink. Option. I would feel better for a few minutes. I'd get a bit of relief. And at the same time, I know I'd probably feel miserable the next day and I'd be back where I started. And the last I drank, I didn't stop for 3 days. And, playing the tape through. What am I going to do instead? So mindfulness really buys us some time, gives us some space. So instead of reacting to the feeling or the thought, we can respond in a way that's in line with our best interests and our goals.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think too, I've noticed that there needs to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there needs to be a practice involved with this. I know for the guys that I see in my practice, we talk about mindfulness more now than ever. And they just kind of look at me and say, well, yeah, I'll try it. What is it again? Tell me that app. And then it kind of goes by the wayside again. And I'm wondering if there's if there's a way, right? Selfishly, I'm like asking you, how do I give them some data, some hard data that says this is how it's going to help with cravings. This is
Yeah.
what it says. It's not just sort of woo woo
Yeah.
learning. Yeah.
It's yeah. I gave a talk at the American Psychological Association conference last year about mindfulness, and I was discussing on a symposium panel, and that was my point. Was really mindfulness is an incredibly powerful tool, and at the same time, I think we've all got a bit of mindfulness fatigue. It's like it's on every magazine cover, and it's this bazillion self-help books, and it's starting to feel, or it has been feeling for a while, like a bit of a but let me tell you, it's not. I mean, the idea of mindfulness or awareness has been around for millennia. It comes out of the Zen tradition, which is at least 2,000 years old. And so mindfulness has been around for a long, long time. And somebody by the name of John Cabot's UMass Medical Center really brought this into the Western sphere. He was a clinician, a clinical psychologist, and he really introduced the idea, that we could use mindfulness in clinical practice as an acceptance-based strategy. And so he developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is an 8-session group course, which is very, very pragmatic and skills-oriented. And then that morphed, and somebody said, Zindel Siegel at the University of Toronto and a few other people thought, you know what, this is dynamite stuff. This mindfulness-based stress reduction really is helping people. There'd been a few clinical trials at that point in the early 90s. And I'm like, I wonder if we could use mindfulness to help people notice the early warning signs of a depression relapse. Yeah. So people with major depressive disorder are much more vulnerable than the general population to have relapses to depression, just like people with addiction are always vulnerable for a relapse to substance use. So he thought, wow, I wonder if we could boost people's mindful awareness, maybe they would start to notice the early warning signs of a return to depression, and they could take evasive measures to avoid that happening. And interestingly, they did a clinical trial, and it didn't work. It didn't work very well at all. And they went back to John Kabat-Zinn and they said, like, your intervention clearly seems to do pretty well in clinical trials. We must just taken your playbook and changed a few things, but we didn't get positive results in our first clinical trial. And he said, well, who's teaching it? And I said, well, we trained some grad students and some postdocs and clinical psychologists to deliver this intervention. He said, well, do they have a mindfulness practice of their own? No, they're clinicians in training, but they're very skillful. They know a lot about the mind and treatment and psychological problems. And he said, well, why don't you send all your research staff to a mindfulness retreat and help them cultivate a mindfulness practice, and then go and redo your clinical trial with practitioners delivering the intervention. And sure enough, they did that, and they got positive results. They saw significant improvements in patient presentation. And I guess the reason I'm telling you this because it's important that we practice what we preach as providers, but also it's a practice. It's not something you can just will your way into. You can't just decide to be more mindful. You can't, as I'm making a gym analogy, you can't just decide to be more fit and have better muscle tone and better stamina. You got to go to the gym. You got to walk the talk, so to speak. Yeah. You've got to go through the practice. And mindfulness is really the same. And that's actually good news, because it means there's no thing we need to figure out. There's no great state we have to find through deep meditation. We don't have to follow practice through a religious tradition like Zen, though that can be very helpful for folks. It's really about doing. Yeah. And from doing, taking the action, by practicing mindfulness, the mind follows and becomes more mindful. Just in the same way, if we're going to the gym regularly, the muscles follow from that, and our cardiovascular system improves, and we have better stamina, better capacity to buffer stress. So it's the same thing And so in mindfulness practice, when we're trying to cultivate mindfulness practices, we start, folks, with very simple exercises. And this is all those 8-week courses in mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based depression, relapse prevention. This is all they're doing, is they're walking people through a series of mindfulness exercises. There's actually very little thought involved. It's very action-based. And so usually we start by doing what we call the raisin exercise. We take about 20 minutes to eat a raisin. It sounds kind of absurd, and it feels a bit absurd while we're doing it, but we really, we pick up a raisin. We encourage people in the group to explore the raisin, feel it in the texture in your fingers, like really look at it as if you had been beamed down from another planet, had never seen a raisin before. You didn't even know what to do with this thing, right? Really slowing things down. And from that, we start to cultivate a practice of mindfulness. And if we do one thing mindfully a day, like wash the dishes mindfully, like really attending to the sensations, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the texture of washing the dishes or eating a meal, that's where mindfulness practice begins. And there's guided meditations as well. They're really helpful. The University of California, San Diego has a great mindfulness institute with an awesome website with dozens of free MP3s you can play through the net. And, there's guided mindfulness meditations from 10 to 40 minutes. And so they're really helpful as well, but we can do anything mindfully. So it's really about making a decision to jump into this practice. And from that, we start to notice that when we are stressed, that when we are experiencing craving, rather than jumping in bed with the experience of craving and getting wrapped up in it and tangled up in it, because, craving is like a vicious cycle. It starts, it's small, and then we're thinking about it, and we're thinking about it some more, and it gets getting bigger, and it's super uncomfortable, and our heart rate's going up, and our blood pressure's rising. And before we know it, we're completely overwhelmed by it. Well, if we're practicing mindfulness every day, when those feelings of craving arise, we often find that we can step back from them and observe them. We don't have to react to them. We can just step back and respond. And so this is how cultivating a daily mindfulness practice can really help at a fundamental level with craving. And in fact, there's a great craving management exercise that we use called surfing. And surfing really involves it's a guided imagery meditation where we imagine ourselves closing our eyes, riding the wave of craving. So we imagine ourselves literally surfing on a big wave, and we imagine the wave coming in through the set, and we come to the top of the wave, and the wave is our craving. And we ride the top of the wave. We just riding it and riding it and riding it as long as the craving lasts. And then noticing how, as is the case for all waves, which eventually run their course, crash onto shore and cease to exist. So it's true for craving as well. This craving's impermanent. It's temporary. Yeah. It's a temporary state, like it's a temporary phenomenon, like a wave. And so we imagine ourselves riding the wave of craving and just noticing the wave petering out. And we can do this. We can do this. We can manage the craving. We can ride it out. We can let it run its course. And if we do that consistently, the cravings start to become less intense and less frequent because we're not fueling them. We're not throwing gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, I like that. I like the wave imagery for sure. I'm wondering now if you could talk a little bit about maybe the brain mechanisms behind mindfulness. I'm just looking for more data. Yeah. Because the addiction hijacks, right? The orbital frontal cortex, among other things. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So full disclosure, I'm not super well read on the fMRI literature on mindfulness-based interventions, but this is really clear. And this is being shown over and over again. Meditation changes the mind. It fundamentally changes the mind, not necessarily the gross morphology of the mind. That means the structure of the brain doesn't necessarily change. So that if you look at a brain scan and MRI of somebody at baseline and then after a year of meditation, the brain is going to look structurally the same. But what you don't get in those images is the complex connectivity between brain cells and neurons. and pathways between sections of the brain that communicate with one another
Mm-hmm.
that are constantly being rewired. And you're absolutely right. Addiction hijacks the reward centers of the brain.
Yeah.
It essentially lays down strong associations between thoughts, feelings, and actions like substance use. And so there's all kinds of complex neurological phenomena arising as a function of addiction that help not only in the development of addiction, but also cause it to be sustained. And so what we can do in meditation practice and in cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy as well, that they also change the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We actually, by changing our thoughts and behaviors and our actions, we start to lay down new tracks in the brain, form new associations. Now you can understand that, but we're talking sort of at the level of the mind. Like when I talk about an association I have, that's a very ephemeral thing. I think about things in conscious awareness in my brain, but that has a physiological underpinning, right? I mean, behind all that, even though we don't really understand it, is a bunch of neurotransmitters, neurons, glial cells, axons, dendrites. Like there's an apparatus here, like a very sophisticated apparatus. So when we change our thoughts, we change our behaviors, we lay down new pathways in the brain. And that's the amazing thing about the human brain. Yeah. Even when we've done quite a lot of damage to it through addiction, still has a remarkable ability to lay down new tracks, to change connections. And for sure, folks in long-term, with, especially with alcohol use disorder, we do lose some of our brain because substances like alcohol are incredibly neurotoxic. But the amazing thing is, unless we're really gone a fair way down that path, it's amazing how the brain can bounce back. And anybody who's had some time in addiction recovery can tell you, the first 6 months to a year can be pretty rocky. People often don't feel on the beam for a while, but eventually they do. And that's really because the brain's repairing itself. It's reestablishing its own equilibrium. Yeah. And so mindfulness meditation is a way of not just calming the ephemeral mind, but also changing connectivity in the brain between brain regions. And we know that the act of meditation activates certain brain area and it reduces the intensity of neurological firing in others, right? So it can reduce the activity in the centers of the brain that are regulating more impulsive primal behaviors, like, wanting to eat everything inside, or, sleep with everybody, or, drink the third bottle of wine, right? So we can actually turn down those centers of the brain a little bit and help to ramp up activity in areas of the brain that are going to inhibit those kinds of behaviors or help us make better decisions that are in line with how we want to live and where we want to be.
So you sent me a good deal of literature before our talk. Thank you. And I was reading a lot about sort of updating the reward values. And so, it sort of is in line with what you're saying about laying down these new associations. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. So, these associations that we had from childhood, maybe that, sugar was so pleasant. It was great. When I was 5, I ate lots of cake and I'm wonderful. And now I eat a ton of sugar and I crash. And so I feel like mindfulness can be used in that way, maybe to like test those old reward values. Is this really relevant to me now?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important point. And we mentioned before that addiction is a process where substance use really hijacks the reward centers of the brain. So alcohol, cocaine, amphetamines, you name it, opioids, all these substances are powerful activators of the dopaminergic reward system in the brain. So we get dopaminergic release, that sort of reward feeling, if you will, from all kinds of pleasurable activities. And it makes sense we've evolved with this capacity because it helps orient us or encourage us to engage in behaviors that are frankly going to keep us and our species alive. So finding shelter when we're cold, like finding warmth when we're cold, eating when we're hungry, these kinds of behaviors are reinforced at a neurological level. and so that we're much more likely to repeat them. Sugar's a good one. I mean, think about our ancestors, primates wouldn't have had access to candy bars, obviously, but at the same time, sugar in that environment would have conferred a lot of survival benefits. So we're wired to seek out sugar. Now we just have too much access to sugar, right? And we have too much access probably to food. And importantly, we have access to drugs, alcohol and other drugs, which are so rewarding. They can generate so much dopamine release on the level of 100 times the kind of dopaminergic release you would get from perhaps eating something nice, having a little bit of sugar. And so that's incredibly rewarding. And what happens is it knocks off the equilibrium of the reward system. And so that it's hard to be rewarded or feel rewarded by other activities. And people will often say in addiction, though they used to have hobbies and interests, like that stuff just doesn't interest them anymore. I remember once a patient of mine was telling me he was feeling awful. He was in very early recovery, and essentially his reward systems were still hijacked by the drugs, and he was playing with his kids, and he just felt nothing. He felt an emptiness, and he knew he loved his kids so much. And he knew once that would have been like just the greatest feeling, and he wasn't feeling anything. And he really felt like there was something wrong with him, like he had been permanently broken. Yeah. And we had a talk about reward systems. And the reality is it's understandable given, his heavy substance use for a period leading up to that point in time, that this other stuff like playing with his kids or even having something good to eat is not going to reward him in the same way, because his brain systems have been recalibrated to tolerate an onslaught of massive amounts of dopamine. The brain actually takes evasive maneuvers at a neurological level to protect itself from being overheated. Just at a very physiological level, the brain makes fundamental changes. And when you suddenly stop substance use, everything's out of whack, and it's going to take some time for those rewards systems to re-regulate. And the great thing about recovery is everybody says at some point they regain interest in those sorts of things. They enjoy playing with their kids again. They like being around people again. Can really get into good food again, gardening and other hobbies. And so that stuff comes back, but it can take a while. And so where does mindfulness sit with that? Well, I think mindfulness can help us ride some of those experiences out. It can help us manage craving because we can step back from it. It can help us manage the discomfort of early recovery, of not being terribly rewarded, of feeling like nothing's going to really do it for you ever again.
Yeah.
That's a bleak feeling, and I think we can bring mindfulness to bear to get through some of those low spots.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So as we kind of wrap up today, any final thoughts for our listeners, that especially the ones that are recovering under quarantine? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of thoughts.
Yeah.
Firstly, I wanted to just put in a plug for mindfulness-based relapse prevention.
Yeah.
Which is an 8-session program which came out of mindfulness-based stress reduction that I spoke about earlier. So it started with stress reduction, then they did one for depression, and then in the late 90s, some folks at the University of Washington, Sarah Bowen, Alan Marlatt, Katie Wickowitz, and a few other people said, you know what, this stuff's dynamite. Like, why aren't we using this for addiction recovery? Like, it just makes so much sense, because addiction's all about reactivity and impulsivity, and like, this is a perfect fit. And so they adapted it again. They essentially took the mindfulness-based stress reduction playbook and modified it. They included strategies like the urge surfing exercise. And that's now, a solid evidence-based relapse prevention intervention. It's not designed as an upfront treatment, but rather it's designed to help people recognize the early warning signs of relapse risk so they can mitigate those risks. At the same time, I think more and more we find ourselves using these kinds of mindfulness strategies in active treatment as well. When people are in very, very early recovery, or even just trying to get into recovery, I think there's a place for them There's a place for mindfulness across the continuum of addiction recovery. So that's right. If you can get in on one of those courses, there are 8 sessions. They're taught in groups. Most major cities are going to have somebody in private practice or at a hospital doing a mindfulness-based relapse prevention group. So firstly, a plug there.
Okay.
Regarding the shelter in place we're currently under for the coronavirus crisis, it sounds kind of trite, doesn't it? But we need to take care of ourselves. We just absolutely have to.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways, one of the ways we can do that is through cultivating a mindfulness practice. We need to eat well too. We need to get a bit of exercise somehow. We need to probably do a lot of things to take care of ourselves in these challenging times, especially for those in addiction recovery or seeking addiction recovery, because there's a whole nother layer of vulnerability. When things really go off the rails in addiction recovery, the risk of returning to substance use or death proposition. So it's so important, folks in recovery are vigilant about their recovery and taking care of themselves as best they can. And, I think there's a silver lining here. We're shuttered up and we're practicing physical distancing. I prefer to say physical distancing than social distancing. I think we need to be socially close, but physically a little distant.
Yeah.
And what an opportunity to start to cultivate a mindfulness practice. We can practice mindfulness anytime, anywhere. Any activity can be done mindfully. We can go for a mindful walk.
I was just going to say, like a mindful walk. Yeah.
A mindful walk. We could do a chore around the house mindfully. We could do a mindful meditation, even just a 5 or 10 minute one. There's so much out there now, on YouTube, and there's so many videos. I usually encourage people to go towards the mindfulness institutes like the University of California, San Diego, University of Washington, and UMass Medical School have great mindfulness institutes and resources on their website.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel you're less likely to have somebody try and sell you a weight loss diet pill, if you're getting your mindfulness meditations from these sources. But YouTube's fine as well. But, what an opportunity to start to cultivate a practice, whether we're in week 1 of recovery or, week 501. We've got some downtime right now, or at least a lot of us do. And perhaps something good that's going to come out of this be that we're able to cultivate a new practice that's going to benefit us in remarkable ways.
David, thank you so much for being on today.
My pleasure.
What are some ways that people can find you on the social?
Yes, absolutely. People can reach out. My email address, if they want to get in contact by email, is deddy@mgh.harvard.edu. That's deddie@mgh.harvard.edu. And also I'm on Twitter at DavidEddyPhD.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again so much for being on.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.